Hello and welcome back to my channel. In the last video I shared that I want to do a rebind on this book. After a few years the spine piece has come out and I think it's due to some of the tension that maybe was too loose when I did it the first time. This is a totally casual video. I want to share the process with you, so let's get to it. First, let's take apart the book. And by the way, if you want to see how I made this whole thing in the first go, I have a whole video about it. You can check it out in the description. I decided not to reuse the existing thread because there's already tension on it and it would be all wonky. So I am going to use the same thread I used, just a new string of it. And luckily I still have some of that left. As I mentioned in the previous video, this is a synthetic thread, and it does say that it is waxed, but in my opinion it's not waxy enough, and that was part of the problem of the binding not holding together, in my opinion, plus some of the tension could be tighter. So my plan is to re-wax the thread and apply a bit more tension in the binding process. In case you're curious about the tools and materials that I'm using, I will also link those in the description. While I take apart the pages of this book, I want to share some of the history behind this binding that I didn't know when I made the first video about it. So this bookbinding technique is widely known as the secret Belgian binding, but the original inventor of this binding didn't get to name it that, and it became known as that, but to set the record straight, Anne Gua, I hope I'm saying that right, named it the Crisscross binding. So that's actually the original name of it, and it references the crisscross pattern that the sewing makes on the binding. Anne has a whole book about this binding and goes through different techniques. I have seen a book review about it and it does look like it comes in French and English. So if you're really interested in this style of binding, I highly recommend checking out the book. I will link a couple of sources down below, as well as some tutorials which I found helpful across YouTube. You can also follow Anne on Instagram for more bookbinding inspiration. I've found that there are many variations and adaptations of the crisscross binding, so mine is not the only way to do it, keep that in mind, and I'm just adapting it to a way that works for my book and for me. Now with all of the old thread gone, I'm going to start with the cover, and I'm going to tape the top and bottom with removable delicate tape. I did this in my original video, but honestly, since I've done this a couple of times now, I don't know if it's necessary anymore, and I experimented with that a little further in the video. I'm keeping about 1 millimeter or 2 space between the spine and the covers because I want this to be a tighter binding. To estimate the amount of thread, I'm stringing it along as many times as there are binding holes along the width of the spine, and this is a really rough estimate. And same thing goes for the pages. For as many signatures there are, I string it along roughly the width of the spine, which would be the folded edge of the signatures. To remedy my original problem, I'm going to wax this thread up. I want it to be double waxed because I found that it was just not grippy enough to hold the spine piece in the book. I do this by pulling it along a piece of beeswax, and I did this 4 times. Not all thread requires this, so it's really depending on your preference and your style of binding and what works for you. And also some thread does come more waxed than this thread, so it can just depend on a lot of factors, and I'm just doing what works for my binding. And I'm doing the same to the other color of thread, which will be for the inside pages. For the binding, I'm referencing my past tutorial, which it might be a little bit out of date since it's more known as crisscross binding, but the techniques that I use in that tutorial are pretty much the same as I'm going to do in this video. Single threading a curved needle, I'm starting on the cover. I won't go into too much detail because I have that tutorial, so if you really want in-depth step-by-step, go check out that video. But I'll just take you along the process here and show you how I pulled the tension like this to make a tighter binding. Tension is a bit tricky and takes some practice for bookbinding, I found, so you don't want to pull too hard that it rips your material, but you don't want to leave it too loose so that it falls apart like this book did. Honestly, it takes practice in my opinion, so don't worry too much if you don't get it right, and it just takes practice. You can see here I added a couple of binder clips to the cover to hold it together since the tape was kind of falling off and not holding it very well. With this binding, I feel like the cover pieces can be tricky at first in keeping them all together, but once I get the binding going, I almost don't need any clips or tape holding it together. The first time I made this book, I do think it was a bit loose because I was recording the process, and after doing this for so many years, I do know that when I'm recording it, the binding is more likely to be on the more loose side because I have to take more breaks and refocus the camera. Having a camera right next to me while I'm binding a book just adds another layer of things I need to pay attention to. So in general, they're usually more loose than what I would like them to be, but I'm more focused on the instruction actually being on the video, if that makes sense. You may have noticed I took a bit of a break from bookbinding projects on my YouTube channel, and it's been about a year since I've done them. And it wasn't intentional, it just ended up happening that way because I was waiting till I actually felt like doing them again. That's really common when you turn any hobby into a YouTube channel over years. You kind of end up losing the joy of them once they become a chore or a job. And it does take balance to not get to that point. So I feel like I'm returning to my book projects with a more healthy, productive mindset. So you might be seeing more book projects on my channel this year, and I have some incomplete ones that I'd like to finish. Thank you for your patience and for sticking around as I explore random other categories of art on this channel that I was not expecting to, but hey, it's an adventure and I'm here to share what I'm working on, so thank you for sticking around. Now for the inside pages, I'm binding the signatures with a curved binding needle and that yellow thread, going under each crisscross area, and I'm doing it just like I did in that tutorial I shared, but I do know that some put the binding needle underneath two crisscross areas at a time. I'm just doing each individually, if that makes sense. But as I mentioned, there are so many different variations of this binding. You can experiment and do what works best for you. I am trying to bind with more tension on this time around, but there were some areas where it was too much and I did rip some of the paper. So if that happens, you just want to make sure you're aware of it and correct yourself as you sew along. Now the binding doesn't feel as loose as it did, and it feels more sturdy of a book. Something else you could try is putting glue just below the thread on the spine piece so that it doesn't move at all. Though that would prevent the cover from doing that fold around trick that this binding does lend itself to. I might have gone overboard and used too much tension since I can't really do that with this book anyway, but I think it's okay. I don't really use that trick much anyway, and this was a good learning experience for thread and tension practice. Only time will tell how my binding holds up, and it is an improvement compared to the previous round.